Well, today we're going to continue the story of Joseph and his brothers. But for reasons that will become clear in a minute, we're not going to start with a scripture reading. First of all, let me just recap what happened last week. Joseph is his father's favorite. He's one of the youngest of a whole bunch of brothers. And he earns the resentment of his brothers because he's been having these dreams, which suggest that he is one day going to be their master. And as fate would have it, they're out far away from their father, and Joseph comes to catch up with them as they're dealing with the herds, and they decide to get rid of their brother. First, they think they're going to kill him, and then Joseph's older brother, Judah, decides, let's not kill him, let's just sell him into slavery. Let a caravan take him to Egypt. And so that's what he do. He ends up going off to Egypt with a slave caravan. Now, many of you know the next part of this story because it's the sexy part, and it's a good fit for Valentine's Day. Joseph arrives in Egypt. He's bought by a court official named Potiphar, who puts him in his house as a household slave. But Joseph, who has God's favor, quickly gets promoted and is pretty soon in charge of all of the slaves in the household. So he's doing good, except that we hear that Joseph is very beautiful, and he attracts the attention of Potiphar's wife. And she finds him quite attractive, and she starts coming on to him. And she comes on to him repeatedly. And in the Sunday school books and the Broadway show about Joseph, she's portrayed as the sort of desperate housewife who wants to get it on with the sexy Jewish pool boy. In the Broadway version of the show, she's played by Joan Collins, wearing the big black hat here in this extraordinarily white cast, which I won't get into this week. If you want to hear about that, please watch last week's sermon. It's a fun, sexy part of the story, and where sexual tension is crackling the entire time. Now, Joseph is a pious Jew, and he refuses to have sex with the boss's wife. This enrages her, and she accuses him of raping her. This lands him in jail, his dignity intact, his rise to the top interrupted, but not for long. As we'll see in the weeks to come, God is still on his side, and he's going to do okay. But there's just one problem with this story, and it's that this isn't actually the way it goes in the Bible. All the details are right, but if you crack open the Bible, when Joseph gets sold into slavery, it doesn't go straight into the story I've just told you, which is the story that shows up in the Broadway show and the Sunday school books. No, a different story is told right there. And the next chapter is all about Joseph's older brother, Judah, and his wife. Older brother, Judah, who gets married, has 3 children, they grow up, and then it's time to marry them off. And it's very curious, because why are we hearing this story about Judah at a time when we want to find out what happened to Joseph when he got carted off to Egypt in slavery? Well, that's a good question and something we're going to talk about in a minute. But first, we're going to hear the story of what happens in this chapter, which usually gets left out. And Joyce Taylor's going to read it for us. But before she does, I just want to set it up a little bit. Judah has married. He's moved away, gotten married, has 3 sons. He wants to marry off his first son, whose name is And it's a strange, strange story. So please listen carefully, because there's a lot of weird twists and turns. And for reasons that will become obvious, we didn't want the kids to hear this story this morning. Take it away, Joyce.
Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went in to his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Joseph sent the kid by his friend, the Adullamite, to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her. Moreover, the townspeople said, 'No prostitute has been here.'" Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, who these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore, he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah.
Thank you, Joyce, for that very spirited reading. Well, wow. Sex, lies, death, deception. Quite a story for Valentine's Day, and you can see why we don't put it in our Sunday school books. But it is in the Bible, inserted right after Joseph is sold into slavery and before he arrives in Egypt. The question is why? Why interrupt such a great story as the Joseph story with this strange, strange story? Well, before we get into that, let me fill in a few details. In the Middle East, back in Tamar and Judah's time, there was a rule about marriage that went like this, that if you married into a family and the first brother that you married was unable to give you children and he died, then it was legal and expected that you were owed the chance to marry the next brother in line so that you could have the promise fulfilled to you to have children. At that time, infant mortality rates were very high. And it was hard to have a family, and families were critical because they were the way in which people kept the family business alive, whether it was a farm or a store. Infants were critical. You needed to have workers, and the workers were your children. So if a woman was unable to have children because a husband had died, then she would live in shame. And she had every right to expect to get pregnant by that family, if not by the first brother that she married. So in this case, Tamar is unable to have children with who dies because he's an evil man. We're never sure why. And then the second brother comes along and won't share his seed with her. And he too is punished and dies. So she's still living in shame because she's an unmarried woman. And she needs to have a child for her to have dignity. So she's sent home to her father's house, and Judah should allow the youngest son to marry her when he's of age. But he sees that so many of her husbands have been dying that he assumes that she is cursed somehow, so he doesn't want to risk it. So he decides to deny her her dignity, deny her the chance to have a child. Now, that means that she is going to be left childless and she will be living in shame for the rest of her life. But Tamar does not give up. When she hears that Judah and the youngest son are coming to town, she disguises herself as a temple prostitute and has sex with her father-in-law so that she can finally have a child with a man from this family. This story highlights that what people want sexually does not always fit in the rules. Tamar is seen as virtuous, even though to the people in her society, she's just a prostitute sitting in the dirt by the side of the road. And that is the story which the Bible has inserted before we hear the tale of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. On the surface, she too seems like a sinful woman. But after hearing Tamar's story, we need to pause. Was she like Tamar? Was her husband cruel? Was her husband unable to give her children? There's no mention of children in this story at all, and Joseph gets treated as though he is a son by Potiphar. So it's possible that Potiphar's wife was very much like Tamar. She was living in shame by not being able to have children, and with Joseph, she saw an opportunity to finally get pregnant. Now, you may be thinking, maybe he's being too clever by half, applying 21st century values to this ancient story. But I'm not alone in thinking that Potiphar's wife wasn't just some vamp. In Jewish midrashes, which are stories which are told about Bible stories, early on, they recognized that there was more to this than appeared in the Bible, that Potiphar's wife was probably not just a shrew temptress, an adulteress trying to get Joseph into trouble. Instead, one of the things they pointed out was that Potiphar's name means court official in Hebrew, but it also has the sense of being, it can also be interpreted as eunuch. So it's entirely possible that he was not able to give her children. And so she, like Tamar, was determined to have children, which in the Bible's eyes was an honorable thing to do within marriage. And in the Muslim world, this story actually shows up in the Quran. The whole story of Joseph being sold into slavery, the temptation by Potiphar's wife, and the rest of the story which we're going to hear. There's a version of it in the Quran. But there's also stories which go beyond what the Quran says. And in those stories, Potiphar's wife, who's given a name, Zuleika, her friends, her girlfriends, notice that she is just lovesick and they can't tell what's going wrong with her because she's starting to lose weight and she's not looking well. And they say, "What's up with you?" And she says, "Well, I have fallen for Joseph. I just can't sleep. I can't eat." And they say, "Why Joseph? What's so special about him?" And she says, "Well, come to my quarters. I'll put you behind a screen and we can have lunch together and you can be there when Joseph comes in. I want you to see Joseph up close for yourself." So the story goes that the women gathered, they sat down and they took out some fruit and they had knives in their hands and they were cutting the fruit, a particular type of fruit that was liked in the Middle East at that time. And they're sitting behind this screen and Joseph comes in. And in the Quran, as well as in the biblical account, Joseph is known to be very, very beautiful. And in the Quran and the Muslim world, they play this up. He's the most beautiful man. And the women are looking at Joseph as he comes in, and they're so shocked by his beauty that their knives slip and they all cut themselves. And afterwards they say, "Okay, we get it now. He's gorgeous. We would want him too." So in the Jewish and the Muslim world, this story is not as straightforward as it seems to be to us. They didn't think that Potiphar was just some tramp. But in the Christian world, in the Christian West, we have interpreted that way. It's as though no one pays attention to Tamar's story. In European paintings, Potiphar is depicted as a very, very white temptress, usually barely clothed. It took me a while to find this picture because most of the paintings of Tamar in European paintings, she's absolutely naked. And I didn't feel comfortable showing that at church. But she always comes across as a temptress. In our Sunday school books and Broadway shows, Potiphar's wife is just a sex-craved temptress. It seems like everyone decided to ignore the Tamar story, which casts a different light on this episode. And that tendency can be found even among biblical scholars. During the 20th century, theologians argue that the placement of Tamar's story just before the Potiphar's wife and Joseph story was a mistake. It was a mistake that had been made by one of the ancient editors of the Bible. Human error. Clearly, Tamar and Judah's story should have been placed after Joseph's story. But not everyone sees it this way. In the late 1960s, a new branch of theology was created called Black theology. It was led by African Americans. It was only in the 1960s that they started to get PhDs and be able to write about how they read the Bible. And one of the things they noticed was that theology had been produced mostly by white people and specifically by white men. The sort of people who write the rules of our society. And so when they read the Bible, they read it as though it's all about rules. But Black theologians argue that there's another way to read the Bible. Blacks have often been on the receiving end of white people's rules. And to them, those rules have often just been an alibi for oppressing others. Slavery was legal. It was done within the rules. Segregation was legal. It was done within the rules. Black theologians point out that for their people, the Bible is not a dusty old document, but an inspiration. In its stories, Black people have drawn strength. In the Bible, they found a God who is consistently on the side of the oppressed, people like Tamar, and like the Israelites who Moses led out of Egypt. To Black theologians, the Bible is the story of God's desire for everyone on earth to be liberated from oppression. And if that means breaking some rules, then so be it. For Black theologians, the Bible is not some relic from the past, but more like a person who is alive right now. Think of it as getting together for coffee with a friend, and the Bible is that friend. The Bible tells the story of how her weekend went. She tells you the story of Tamar and Potiphar's wife. That's my reality, she says. What's your reality? And you tell her about your life. But like coffee with a real person, the way you tell your story is going to be influenced by what you just heard, the details you leave in and the details you leave out. So the Bible's just been telling us this story over coffee about sex and rules. So let's talk about how that works out in our life. Well, over the cup of coffee, we'd have to explain in our time the rules of marriage have changed. We no longer marry just to have children. You know the old song, first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the baby carriage. Well, often the baby in the baby carriage doesn't even come along anymore because people get married for love. They get married thinking that in this relationship, they will find personal fulfillment, and they may or may not have children. Lots of people get divorced who have children. Having children on its own doesn't stop them from getting divorced. But they get divorced because they're looking for a fulfillment they're not finding in that relationship. Marriage isn't about children anymore. It's about happiness and personal fulfillment. And part of that definition of happiness is sexual satisfaction. The rules say that we can only have sex with our spouse. And that's where things get complicated. Because like in biblical times, sexual desire does not always want to live by the rules. In marriage, we crave equality between two partners. But sexual desire doesn't always dance to that tune. Desire craves difference. The old adage that opposites attract is absolutely true when it comes to sexual desire. That's what turns us on, is difference, that frisson. Our love stories are full of people who are from opposite sides of the tracks. And forbidden love. Tamar and Judah, Romeo and Juliet, Lancelot and Guinevere, Anakin Skywalker and Padme in Star Wars, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, the president and the intern. And in fact, in terms of what we are willing to pay money for our fantasies, the absolute top-selling books of the last 10 years were hands down by a long shot, 50 Shades of Grey. The story of a very powerful male billionaire and his love affair or sex affair with a young female literature student. Equality is great to build a partnership with, but difference is what turns us on. And it's not just in stories. At the same time as we expect our love relationships to be based on equality, in many couples, both spouses work. Workplaces are supposed to be based on merit and performance. You do well, you rise up through the ranks, get promoted, make more money. Workplaces are hierarchical, defined by rules and regulations. And that's why they are the perfect place for sexual desire to bloom. Studies of modern companies have found that over half of all workers have had romantic relationships with coworkers. Most of those relationships were with people higher or lower than them in the corporate hierarchy. And 36% of workplace love affairs involved married people. Sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes they were both married to other people. The Me Too movement has brought workplace sexual harassment into the spotlight. And what's become clear is that for powerful men, the presence of less powerful women and men, in some cases, is hugely enticing. And they're willing to risk their careers and their marriages and their relationships and their reputation to get what they desire. This is grotesquely unfair to the women who are involved, who may be afraid to say no or to complain, and often end up having to leave work because of the unwanted advances of one of their superiors. Better rules are needed, certainly. But that alone won't solve the problem, because sexual desire can find breaking the rules part of the thrill. And whether it's two single people dating each other or a sexual predator harassing someone lower in the ranks, like the rom-com says, it's complicated. Sex and rules collide. They don't fall into place with each other easily. At this point, as you're explaining this to the Bible, I imagine her nodding her head. And she says, I hear that. Rules and sex often do not make good bedfellows. But the Bible doesn't jump in and say, here's the simple answer, because there isn't one. Tamar has desires which she knows she has a right to have fulfilled, and she's willing to break a lot of rules to get them. And Potiphar's wife does the same, but she lied and endangered someone in the process. So is the Bible saying that we should all just break the rules anytime we want to fulfill our desires? Isn't that what Harvey Weinstein would say? I imagine the Bible taking a big sip of coffee and getting quiet for a moment. The way I see it, the Bible says after a long pause, is that it's all about dignity. Tamar could not have her dignity restored until she had a child with someone from Judah's family, even if it meant Judah himself, her father-in-law. She was promised a child, and she was going to get it from that family of liars. So she did what she had to do. And the kicker is, those twins that she has at the end of the story, one of them is the start of the line that will lead to King David, who's like the hero of the Old Testament, the man who's able to defeat Goliath and create the first Jewish kingdom. He gets his gumption, this story is telling us, because one of his great-great-great-great-grandmothers had guts and determination and was determined to have her dignity restored. And if you crack open the New Testament and you go to Matthew's genealogy of Mary, you'll find Tamar's name is in there too. So Tamar matters, and the Bible thinks she's really important because she went after her dignity. And that desire for dignity applies to Joseph too. He stands firm, refusing to have sex with the boss's wife. But God doesn't strike Potiphar's wife down dead the way God struck down Tamar's first two husbands. God understands desire and dignity. But dignity is what matters most. When we keep our dignity, everyone wins. Tamar asserted her dignity, and even Judah, who had been tricked, finally saw that and said that she is more righteous than I am. When people stand up for their dignity, whether in getting sex or refusing it, the world wins. It may not be easy, but it's the best path. Because evil cannot inhabit a person who keeps their dignity. Then the Bible pauses and looks at you. So where are you finding your dignity? Where do you make that happen within your relationship and at work when people come on to you? How are you going to preserve your dignity so you can make the world a better place for everyone? And how are you going to help other people regain their dignity? Are you ready to change the rules to make that happen? Even to challenge them? Tamar was. She did good. And that's a story we shouldn't leave out. Amen.